Thanks. Yeah, so as a user of GitOps and Flux, I just wanted to share what the values that they bring are, and also give my user experience as well. So I am Priyanka Ravi. I also go by Pinky, and I am a developer experience engineer at Weaveworks, and I'm dog mom to 2 rescues. They're back there. They're locked in here with me right now because they're barkers. So hopefully this keeps them from barking. Um, Basically, I want to start off with just a brief introduction to what is Kubernetes, if you're not familiar, to set the groundwork of what I'm about to talk about. Basically, Kubernetes is an open source system for automating deployment, scaling, and management of containerized applications. A Kubernetes cluster consists of a set of worker machines called nodes that run containerized applications. Every cluster has at least one worker node, and the worker nodes host the pods that are the components of the application workload. And then there's a control plane that manages the worker nodes and the pods in the cluster. And basically, the control plane is made up of components that make global decisions about the cluster, as well as detecting and responding to cluster events. With Kubernetes, your app teams don't have to worry about managing a server and all that. There's an abstraction away from the nitty-gritty, and it allows teams basically to focus on development and innovation instead. So the things that really matter. And also, Kubernetes is a part of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, or the CNCF. And if you're not familiar with it, the CNCF is an open source software foundation that promotes the adoption of cloud native computing. So this is a really huge view of how enormous the ecosystem is within the CNCF. It has tons of great projects. And as you can see, it's divided into different categories. And app definition and development is one of several main categories within the CNCF. And this happens to be where CI/CD lives, continuous integration and continuous delivery, which is where our focus is today with Gitops and the Flux project. So Flux was actually donated by Weaveworks to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation as a sandbox project in July of 2019. And within the CNCF, basically projects have maturity levels, which just signals to what sorts of enterprises should be adopting them. And a year after entering CNCF in July of 2020, Flux was one of only 2 projects in the adopt category of the CNCF Continuous Delivery Tech Radar. And Flux then went from sandbox to incubation in March of 2021. And in November of 2021, Flux underwent a security audit in preparation for our application to graduate, which is the highest level maturity level within the CNCF. And this month, we actually submitted our graduation application. So it's very exciting. So what is GitOps? GitOps is actually an operating model for cloud native applications such as Kubernetes, but I do want to highlight that it's not just for Kubernetes. If you are doing a multi-cloud infrastructure, like I had been doing in the past, then you can actually still use GitOps. But because we'll be talking about Flux, we're going to be focusing more on Kubernetes. But I kind of will mention a little bit later about my own user experience and how that worked. And that was obviously a multi-cloud infrastructure, like I mentioned. So basically, GitOps utilizes a version controlled system, most commonly Git, as the single source of truth. And basically, using GitOps, it enables continuous delivery through automated deployment, monitoring, and management by a version controlled system. And by using GitOps, you're actually managing your infrastructure and applications declaratively. So that kind of brings us into these things called the Gitops Principles. And the Gitops Principles are basically a set of best practices that have been defined through discussions with different vendors and users based on their experiences by the Gitops working group. And if you are interested in that, you can learn more about that at opengitops.dev. And basically, don't feel like you have to have all of these done in order to use GitOps. Everyone's journey is so totally different, and you can use GitOps basically and then add in hardening and tweak your setup to meet these guidelines as you go. So the first principle is that a system managed by GitOps must have its desired state expressed declaratively. Basically, everything's written in code. By doing this, things are more reusable. There's an audit trail. So many other benefits that come from having your desired state expressed declaratively as well. And then the second one is that a desired state is stored in a way that enforces immutability versioning and retains a complete version history. There's no sneaking in a change. You have a whole audit trail and stuff like that. The third one is that software agents automatically pull the desired state declarations from the source. And the fourth one is that software agents continuously observe actual system state and attempt to apply the desired state. So basically what that means is that there's something that's living on like your Kubernetes cluster and is actually checking the source, so your Git source, and making sure that what is actually applied in your Kubernetes cluster is what was stated in your declarative state. And by doing this, you're actually avoiding things like configuration drift, bad actors that are coming in and maybe messing with the actual deployments that are out there. So everything is exactly how you wanted it to be in production. So why GitOps? Why does this even matter? What's the benefits of this? Basically, individuals, teams, and organizations who implement GitOps experience tons of benefits, including stronger security guarantees. GitOps' tools, basically a unique ability to treat everything as code, creates a direct impact on security. For example, if all configuration and security policy is treated as code, everything can be held in version control. So basically, any and all changes that are made are reviewed and then they're input into an automated process. So there's no manual processes. And with that, you basically increase the developer and operational productivity because they don't have to worry about the manual processes that are in the old school way of getting code out to production. And then it also enhances the developer experience because if there's no manual processes, then you're less likely to be at work on a weekend for some accidental thing that happened during the deployment process. It also, because of its declarative nature, it improves the stability, there's a higher reliability, and there's a consistency and standardization as well. So now I'm going to talk about what is Flux. So Flux is a Git-centric package manager for your applications, but Git isn't technically the only system you can use. I'll touch on that a little bit later. But basically, it provides a set of continuous and progressive delivery solutions for Kubernetes. And it is a natural extension of the benefits of Kubernetes. It was created completely with Kubernetes in mind. And so at the core of it, basically, it continuously monitors your version control system. And it applies the desired state that's been declaratively stated there. So the nice thing about this is that you don't have to worry about things like configuration drift, like I mentioned, because it reconciles on a schedule. So if things have gotten out of sync for some reason, it will actually set it back to the desired state. And also Flux really reduces developer burden because it removes the need for manual deployment processes. And also Flux has a command line tool that is a very convenient way to get started using Flux, that you can bootstrap the system in a cluster and use it to access the custom resources that make up the API as well. So these are just some little statements that I just wanted to show real quick. So these are like some statements that we like to say about Flux. They give you a good like broad overview of Flux. I'm going to touch on them in more detail in a little bit. So I'm going to come back to these soon. And now I just want to say, like, what are the benefits of Flux? First benefit is that it reduces developer burden. It does this also by removing the kube control problem. You don't have to worry about kube control versions and to be able to interact with the cluster. Also, Flux is extensible. It's really versatile. It works with existing tools. It's super flexible. It's a modular, and also because it's a natural extension of Kubernetes, it plays well with a lot of other tools that you're already using within Kubernetes. And also because of the microservice architecture, you can basically pick and choose what you want your experience to look like and tailor it to your own needs. And then it also comes with out-of-the-box support for Customize and Helm as well. So I mentioned it's a microservice architecture. Basically, Flux is made up of a set of Kubernetes controllers. And if you're not familiar with controllers, basically a controller handles the lifecycle of objects in Kubernetes. And so basically what should be done when an object is created, updated, or deleted, things like that. And then I'm going to go into what each of these controllers do really briefly. So the source controller basically fetches resources and stores them as artifacts from the source that you set up, so Git. And then the customized controller then takes those manifests and applies them. And it also runs manifest generation using Customize in the background. The Helm controller actually manages the deployment of Helm charts, and the notification controller manages notification dispatch. It specializes in handling inbound and outbound events as well. So The image reflector controller reflects image metadata for automation for the automation controller, and the image automation controller updates YAML when new container images are available. So basically, those two work together to update a Git repository when new container images are available. And so now I'm going to go back to those statements that I mentioned earlier and dive into like a little detail on each of them. So Flux actually provides GitOps for both apps and infrastructure. Flux, and along with the use of Flagger, you can actually deploy apps with canaries, feature flags, and A/B rollout. So using both, so you can utilize Flagger if you are using things like progressive delivery architecture or anything like that. Also, there's a self-led workshop that includes Flagger that would be a great resource if you are interested in trying it out. It's at eks.handson.flagger.dev. And Flux can also manage any Kubernetes resource. And also infrastructure and workload dependency management is built in. So there's a really cool feature called depends on. And basically with depends on, if you have an application that, for example, if you have an application that requires a database, say, and the database needs to be stood up before the application can run properly, then you can actually use depends on to say that, the database has to be stood up and running and healthy before the application is stood up, which is a really cool feature. Basically, just push to Git and Flux does the rest. Flux enables application deployment and progressive delivery with the help of Flagger through automatic reconciliation. So it's continuously reconciling all your changes. And Flux can actually even push back to Git, like I mentioned, for you with automated container image updates to Git. So it can do image scanning and patching. And it works with your existing tools. So this is really cool. It works with your Git providers, like I mentioned, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, but it can even use S3 compatible buckets as a source. So that's what I was alluding to earlier when I said that there's other sources that you could use. And then also it works with all major container registries and all CI workflow providers as well. And it works with any Kubernetes and all common Kubernetes tooling. It works with Kustomize, Helm, RBAC, and policy-driven validation, such as OPA, Kyverno, admission controllers. So really, it just falls into place into the existing ecosystem you already have set up probably for what you're using, which is really neat. And Flux does multi-tenancy, and as we like to say, multi-everything. Flux uses true Kubernetes RBAC via impersonation and supports multiple Git repositories as well. With the multi-cluster infrastructure and apps, they work out of the box with Cluster API. And Flux can use one Kubernetes cluster to manage apps in either the same or in other clusters. It can spin up additional clusters itself and manage clusters, including lifecycles and fleets. Also, Flux has great alerting and notification built in as well. Flux can provide health assessments, and it can alert to external systems and external events handling. Basically, you could even do like a Git push, and then you get notified on Slack and other chat systems. And users really trust Flux. Like I mentioned earlier, Flux is a CNCF incubating project, which applied for graduation recently and was only one of only 2 projects alongside Helm categorized as adopt on the CNCF CI/CD Tech Radar. And then also Flux has a lovely community that is very easy to work with. We welcome contributors of any kind. The components of Flux are on Kubernetes core controller runtime. So anyone can contribute and its functionalities can be extended very easily. And there's links to get started with contributing to Flux. We have that in our docs as well. And Flux really works with a ton of other tools. I listed out a bunch here, but there's so much more even than this. I'm not going to read them all to you, but basically I just wanted to show that there's a lot of tools that it does work with. So basically most of the things that you're already using in your architecture, it just works with. So now I'm going to tell you about my own journey with GitOps. When I first started on this, I was actually on a delivery engineering team at my last company. And we actually ended up basically being the GitOps platform team eventually. But basically when I first started, we had not heard of GitOps. We didn't know what it was. And then one of the people that I worked with actually went to KubeCon and came back with all these stories of all these things he'd heard about GitOps and all this stuff. So that's the first time we ever even heard about it. And we recognized that there was a need for change and that there's so many benefits of GitOps. And at the time, the company was just kind of getting started with AWS. And so we needed a way to do automated software changes to AWS. We didn't have a structure in place. And we're like, why not this GitOps process, right? It's very cool. It's already utilizing tools that you already have, such as Git. And why involve another third-party vendor or something like that in order to manage your audit trail and change requirements, right? So that was the whole need for it. We definitely got pushback for sure. There were a lot of people that said, like auditors are not going to want to learn GitLab or GitHub or whatever you're using. And we definitely heard that. But the thing that really drove us was that at the same time as we're hearing that from both the change management team, but also the managers were like, now you're telling me I have to go log into GitLab or GitHub or whatever and like, accept merge requests or whatever. But at the same time, we were hearing that side. We were also hearing developers saying, man, if you can make this happen, you're going to be our heroes. Like, this is going to change everything, right? Not just is it going to change not having to go out to this third-party tool, it's going to streamline the process and make it much, much faster. So instead of waiting, you see sometimes some teams have to wait like a day to get code into production because they have to wait for this long process to happen. Instead, now you have this way of just doing it all within the same Git tool that you're already using. And something's just listening and automatically pulling those changes in once it's pushed into that config repo. And so we got a lot of that. And that was like what made us feel good about what we were doing. And so we actually had a dedicated team that was, that was all we did was like try to figure out how we're going to do this GitOps process. And we did a lot of POCs. There was a lot of that to kind of prove the worth of what we were talking about and to show people that this is actually possible. I think not having those POCs and just talking at people makes it very difficult to actually show them like, this is what it's going to look like. And this is the value that it's going to bring. And then there was a lot of filling in the gap. There are certain things that Flux can't even do, like managing how your config, your manifests get from your source code repo to your config repo. So we were kind of basically making that whole process how it was. And we did a lot of things, I think, on our own. I have a lessons learned slide in the next slide, but I think we didn't really leverage as much outside expertise as we could have. We were kind of just trying to make things work. And so, yeah, we did a lot of that as well. And then how we actually set up the config repos and stuff like that. We managed all that. We created tools for that. And then multi-tenancy, which is something that I'm very passionate about as well, was when we finally got to Kubernetes and making that GitOpsified, we also realized that taking advantage of multi-tenancy would be a great thing for our Kubernetes platform because you can control how the namespaces are created when a team needs a new namespace. You can actually just write all that declaratively and then let Flux actually manage all of that. So the nice thing about that is you don't even have to use kube control to go see like what namespaces exist and all of that. You can just go look at the code and everything's written very declaratively. So it's, it's very easy to see what's actually out there. And then a big part of what we did was education and evangelizing in order to get people to, be able to use this process, because like I mentioned before, AWS was the first platform that we made this available for, but it was the only accepted way for code to get out to production. GitOps was the only way that we had. And so there was a lot of education. We jumped onto internal roadshows, internal conferences, and just tried to get the user experience to be the best that it could be to get onboarded onto the process. And then also externally as well, we were really lucky in being able to talk at different conferences and be able to share our own experience with other people that were trying to do something similar and to hopefully, enable them and empower them to be able to do it at their company as well. And then one thing that was really important to us was metrics and observability. We could actually see like deployment events, basically determine how many people are actually using GitOps. We had change lead time also, so we could time the code changes pushed in source repo to when it was applied and merged in your target config repo and to when it was realized into production or your target environment. And then we could also see the change size, like how many files were changed, how many lines of codes were changed. And then another thing was hardening. We wanted to lock down credential management as well as embrace policy as code. So we took advantage of things like Kyverno and OPA as well. And then We also had governance. So we were using like instant notifications with Flux to alert necessary stakeholders when merge requests are approved, basically. And also one thing that we had is to make sure like if a merge request was approved without the authorized approval. So if there was basically any shenanigans that were being done, we were also alerted, which was really cool. So we definitely learned a lot of lessons through our journey. One thing is that, you know, being in a highly regulated industry like I was, or in a large organization like I was, it's definitely very slow to adopt and implement. We were very lucky that we got all of this basically, you know, in place within a year, but I have heard from other people that the process is even slower than that. But I do want to say, you know, don't be discouraged by that. You can't just try to lift and shift basically to GitOps. Take the time to assess what really needs to be done to achieve success in your situation, and don't rush that whole process. It's very important to, like, you know what your situation is. And then also, like I said, I wish we had leveraged outside expertise for sure. You know, companies like Weaveworks, or there's other companies out there that are willing to help with GitOps as well. And also the Flux community itself. The community is super, super helpful. I've seen a lot of people ask questions there and get their questions answered there. So like leverage what you can for sure. Don't just try to like make everything yourself. And then also in our case, having a dedicated team with clearly defined roles and responsibilities was critical in our success for sure. But I don't think you have to have this. I mean, I know some companies aren't, you know, able to just dedicate a team just to implementing GitOps. But the way I see it is with that, you know, standardization, there's one team that's like telling you how you do GitOps, then at least you don't have a bunch of teams coming up with their own processes, and there's like a standard way of doing it within the company. So everyone's kind of on the same page, which is nice. So reasons I and others love Flux: it makes life easier. Basically, getting your application to production is the entire goal of the development lifecycle. Flux is a tool that was created to make the process simpler and more efficient, and it gives developers the ability to focus on what really matters, which is innovation and the user experience. And then multi-tenancy, like I mentioned, it's super great with Flux. Being able to actually control your infrastructure like that is pretty awesome in a declarative nature. And then I mentioned depends on earlier. Basically, that's a really cool feature as well. Helm integration is fantastic with Flux. I'm a big fan of Helm, and it really is just very easy to use. Also, Flux does notifications and alerting, which is really cool. And using the Flux CLI, you can actually bootstrap, like I mentioned. Just that's how you can get started really easily with Flux. And the Flux CLI is awesome. It's one of my favorite CLIs. And even before I joined Weaveworks, I was like, I really love this CLI. It's super, super user friendly. If you type in any like help commands, like with any of the subcommands, it'll give you like a complete explanation of what that subcommand does, but it also gives you a bunch of examples of how to run that command, and then all of the flags. So it's really, really user friendly. You can just like copy and paste one of the examples and it works. And then if you do want to get started with GitOps and Flux, here's a bunch of links to that. Basically, fluxcd.io is our docs page. So if you want to get started, you can go there.